Now, councils play an essential role in the conservation and management of biodiversity and nature across the globe. Councils have the opportunity to align the work that they do conserving and restoring nature and biodiversity with national and global targets and various initiatives championing the vision of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, as we'll now be referring to it for the rest of the day. Today we have 4 awesome speakers exploring how councils can translate these high-level targets and campaigns into local action. So firstly, we've got Ingrid Coetzee, the Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health from ICLEI Africa and the Global Cities Biodiversity Centre. She'll be joining us from South Africa. We have Rob Law, Senior Manager of Energy Transitions from WWF. Now, Rob has over 20 years' experience working on climate change and environmental challenges for governments, communities, and not-for-profit organisations. And I think many of you might know Rob from the work he's done working with the Eastern, Northern, and Central Victorian Greenhouse Alliances in Victoria. We also have Judy Bush, Dr. Judy Bush, Senior DECRA Research Fellow, Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning from the University of Melbourne. Now, her research and teaching focuses on urban environmental policy and governance, urban nature-based solutions, biodiversity and climate change perspectives. She completed her PhD entitled Cooling Cities with Green Space Policy Perspectives at the University of Melbourne. Now, last but not least, we have Councillor Amanda Stone. Now, Amanda is an outgoing 4-term councillor at Yarra City Council here in the inner northern suburbs of Melbourne, where she's championed action on climate, biodiversity and social justice. She's been the chair of the ICLEI Oceania Regional Executive since 2020, was on the ICLEI Global Executive and has been advisor to ICLEI on nature, biodiversity and ecosystem restoration until June this year. So Amanda has been very privileged to attend COP15 in Montreal, where the new Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted, and has presented in numerous forums on nature and biodiversity for ICLEI. I'd actually like to now hand over to Councillor Stone for the acknowledgement of country. And as she's doing that, feel free to put in details where you're joining us from today into the meeting chat. Amanda, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Cara. Cara and I and Steve are hosting this online meeting today from Melbourne, Naarm, which is in Wurundjeri country. So we acknowledge the Wurundjeri Wurrung people as the traditional owners of the land that we're on today. But we also recognise the traditional owners of all the countries that you're joining us from today. And from coast to coast, we pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their cultures and connections to the land and waters of Australia. And I think that's particularly relevant in today's discussion. I have the great honour of introducing Ingrid Coetzee. Ingrid is not here in person. There's a big time difference between here and South Africa, where she's based. So she recorded her presentation yesterday. And I will just simply get started on that, and I'll speak about it at the end. Thank you. Have I caught you out? Sorry. There we go.
Good day, everybody. I'm Ingrid Coetzee, the Director of Biodiversity, Nature and Health at ICLEI's Global Cities Biodiversity Centre, and I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm going to speak to you today about the Global Biodiversity Framework, but before we do that, I want to step back and look at the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, so that we can understand the framework better. It is a framework convention that was adopted in the 1990s. It forms one of the 3 Rio Conventions, and to date it has been ratified by around 196 state parties. Its 3 objectives are to conserve biological diversity, to ensure the sustainable use of biodiversity, and ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. With this slide, what I want to show you is the mechanisms and the structures for the implementation of the CBD. So in the diagram on the left, you'll see the COP in the middle, the Conference of Parties. This meets every second year. And then, of course, it has its secretariat, and there are 2 subsidiary bodies. There are also the bodies that relate to the various protocols. The financial mechanisms that support implementation of the GEF, or Global Environmental Facility. And then there's a range of other organizations that are involved in its implementation, including also the various major groups. So the CBD is quite unique amongst the Rio Conventions in that it recognizes major groups such as Indigenous peoples and local communities, women, as well as local and subnational governments in its various processes. So with this slide, what I want to show is some milestones for local action for biodiversity at the level of cities. The first one was the so-called LAB program, or Local Action for Biodiversity, which was initiated in 2006 by ICLEI and the IUCN. And it was something that really also engaged at the level of biodiversity advocacy in the CBD processes and space. And then there was, a few years later, the Curitiba Declaration on Cities and Biodiversities. This is when a group of mayors got together at the COP in Curitiba and came out with a declaration. And that led to the first summit of cities and subnational governments, which was held in Bonn, Germany at CBD COP 9 in 2008. That followed a series of successive summits that were held at the COPs as official parallel events of the COP, and these always took place in the main negotiating rooms over the session break. And then during the COVID period, when we were negotiating the new biodiversity framework, which we today know as the Global Biodiversity Framework, there was the Edinburgh process, and that led to the Edinburgh Declaration, which was led by the Government of Scotland in very close collaboration also with ICLEI and a few other partners. And then, of course, the other one that I just want to highlight is the Cities with Nature and Regions with Nature platforms, which I know Cara is going to talk about a little later. But the significance of them in terms of being a milestone is that these platforms are recognized in a CBD decision that was adopted in Montreal in 2022 as being the online platforms where cities should capture and measure progress and report on the commitments and the actions they're taking towards implementing the targets in the GBF. So my next 2 slides are just very quick to show you some snapshots from some of these summits that were held. The one on the left is from Mexico, and then the one on the right is the one from Montreal 2022. And the significance of these summits is that they led not just to major declarations or communiques, as you can see up there on the screen, but also in both 2020 in Nagoya and then in 2022 in Montreal, to decisions on engaging cities and subnational governments in implementing the convention. And in fact, since the very first summit, there has been more than 20 decisions adopted at the COPs that recognize the role of cities and subnational governments in implementing the convention and objectives and targets. Now we get to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and it's significant for cities and subnational governments in a number of instances. One of them being the fact that it introduces the whole of government approach. In its implementation mechanisms, it recognizes that there needs to be partnerships at all levels of government. And then there are a series of enabling conditions that recognize local and subnational governments. And of course, as I mentioned just now, the important decision with its plan of action for engaging subnational governments. So even at the level of targets, it's important to understand that the GBF contains the first target, target 12, that specifically refers to cities in a UN convention and specifically within the CBD. But there are various other targets that are relevant as well. For example, target 14, which talks about biodiversity mainstreaming, target 7 on reducing pollution risks, Target 11 on nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services and functions, and even the so-called 30 by 30 targets, which talks to the protection and the restoration of important biodiversity and ecosystem areas. This is just to give you an idea of all the decisions adopted at COP15 in Montreal that speak to cities and subnational governments. You can see they deal with monitoring, reporting, resource mobilization, capacity building, invasive species, etc. And then the very important one that I keep highlighting, which is CBD Decision 1512. And that is the dedicated decision and plan of action for cities and subnational governments. So in relation to Decision 1512, it's important to understand that the CBD is the only Rio Convention that has a mechanism for multi-level governance and sets out how local and subnational governments should become engaged in implementing the GBF, but also has a plan of action in terms of how they can specifically contribute to the targets and the various other aspects of the GBF. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but there it is just to show you. And if you want to have a look at it, you can find it on the website under CBD Decisions 1512. But I think the thing that I do want to emphasize is that as a city government, what would be important in terms of implementing this decision, but also with the plan of action, it speaks to aligning local priorities and actions with national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or state or province-led biodiversity strategies and action plans. You know, and prioritizing and implementing projects that can contribute to the various targets. At the urban city level, what is really important is also how to mainstream biodiversity into land use and spatial plans or decisions on infrastructure delivery, introducing nature-based solutions to address urban challenges, and then of course working closely, which I know does happen in many countries, between the various levels of government to identify guidelines and capacity building instruments, financial mechanisms to support greater investment, etc. So these are all important. With this slide, I'm just going to highlight some of the engagement opportunities for cities and regions at COP16 in Cali, Colombia. As tradition has, we will be holding the 8th summit for subnational governments and cities on the 26th of October. This is preceded the evening before by a closed roundtable event just for mayors and governors to express their ambitions and commitments to the COP presidency. And then there's a range of other events. I'm not going to go into detail, but suffice to say that between the 22nd of October and the 30th of October, we will, in the Plus Quebec Action Zone at the local and subnational governments major group hub, we will also be running a series of sessions and events. On this slide, you can see the summit logo on the right hand, and on the left, the COP16 logo and the various convening partners, co-hosts, and additional partners. So with this slide, I just want to give you a bit of an idea of the summit themes, which are aligned to the COP priorities. Partnering, which will focus on bridging finance gap and securing greater investment for nature at subnational levels. Progress, which looks at what implementation progress has been made to date, and then peace, which speaks to living in harmony and making peace with nature. And then we will close the session with a whole series of very exciting announcements. This slide just gives a taste of some of the announcements and launches that will take place. The Berlin Pact, which Cara will talk about a little bit later. And we will also be celebrating the cities and regions that have joined Cities of Nature and Regions with Nature. And I end with this slide, which gives you the QR codes where you can find more information, or else you can email biodiversity@iclei.org. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks to Ingrid. That was a really comprehensive outline of the CBD and the mechanisms by which it is enacted. She's also highlighted the role of ICLEI in ensuring that local government is front and centre in the various renegotiations of these COPs and the frameworks, particularly the most recent Kunming-Montreal framework. It's the only convention where negotiations actually include local government at the table, and Ingrid was involved in all the discussions that led up to that Global Biodiversity Framework agreement in Montreal 2 years ago. She's highlighted Decision 1512, which there's a lot of technical language in her presentation, but that particular decision is important to reflect on because it specifies that countries that have signed up to this have agreed to facilitate increased involvement of local and subnational governments in the revision of their action plans and the implementation and reporting. And they've also agreed to support cities and subnational governments in managing biodiversity sustainably, providing ecosystem services and mainstreaming biodiversity in urban planning and development. And of course, there's a lot of discussion at the moment, isn't there, on multi-level governance, all levels of government working together. We're not seeing it happening in a very streamlined or coordinated way in Australia. And this is a goal for us as a sector to have, I think, and ICLEI will be playing a role in that, particularly around climate and biodiversity. It's also a subject of discussion, obviously, in climate change, and the climate COP in Dubai last year endorsed an agreement called CHAMP, which you've probably heard of, the Coalition for High Ambition Multi-Level Partnerships. Australia signed that, and signatories have agreed to work with local governments in determining NDCs and achieving the targets that we've signed up to. So this idea of multi-level governance has been very strong in the Convention of Biological Diversity and the frameworks that have come out of that. And there's a great opportunity for all of us to get really involved and maybe take a bit of a lead in showing our national governments how it can be done. And we're now going to hear from two wonderful speakers who are going to show what it might look like on the ground, implementing the framework at a local government level. But perhaps we can also think about how we can show to our national government how we might all work together to achieve these very necessary and ambitious goals so that we're all living in harmony with nature by 2050. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rob Law from Worldwide Fund for Nature, who's going to present to you now.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks everyone. Good to be here. And thank you, Sharon and Cara, for accommodating some date changes to help me out with some personal leave, but really excited to be able to talk to you today. My background, as was mentioned earlier, I spent a long time with local government and with the Victorian Greenhouse Alliances, which are fairly climate focused, but now for the last sort of 9 months sort of been at WWF, so a very different experience, being at the largest world conservation organisation. And I used to work for them 18 years ago, so coming back has been interesting. But my role at WWF's really focused around energy, but I'm not sort of really talking about that today because we work within our team around nature positive across all the different sectors of the economy, and really working with our global colleagues to give shape to what this concept means. And so I'm pretty keen to sort of talk that through today and maybe what that sort of looks like at a local level. I'll just sort of reiterate, I think, my own views about the really critical role that local governments play in these global processes, climate, biodiversity, whatever it is, not just through advocacy, but also just, through showing how things are done and putting the meat on the bones of these fairly, often abstract concepts that happen and very technical concepts that happen at the global level. There's a really important value that cities and subnational governments play in sort of demonstrating how this stuff can happen on the ground. I always like to zoom out when I start, and this is really just to sort of note, that environmentalism, or our concern for nature, has been around for many centuries now and has evolved a lot, particularly in Western society. Moving from this idea of national parks being nature being somewhere else that you go and visit on a weekend or on a holiday. And over time, through the role of Indigenous communities and decolonising and other perspectives, really helping to start to shift our thinking about what nature is and thinking about it in a much more integrated systems sort of way about the way that we live. But through this history, there's no doubt that we're sort of facing this continual decline of nature in all of its different elements. So this is this idea that we kind of need a new story. There's been many different concepts and ideas that have come up throughout the last decades, and many sort of buzzwords, etc., that have sort of attempted to sort of address this. But we're really faced with this challenge that we are in a nature crisis and need to do something about it. So I won't dwell on this too much because it's depressing and most people know it, but we are in the sixth mass extinction, and just that number down the bottom right is just really pretty compelling when you read it. Sort of 100 to 1,000 times higher the rate of species extinction compared to the last tens of millions of years. So I think it's fair to say that the climate crisis gets a lot of attention, but the biodiversity crisis is no less important. One of my colleagues at WWF, who's now at Griffith, did this study a little while ago about what are the drivers of loss for nature within Australia. And on that left there, it's probably hard to see, but there's I think a fairly useful sort of array of all the different sort of processes or threats to nature, and the manner in which sort of the loss of nature happens through death of 1,000 cuts. So, but what I think is interesting here from a local government perspective is that there's lots of different touch points here of where councils have either a direct influence or some way of influencing some of these processes, whether it's urban development or transportation or weeds and invasive species, through to light pollution and effluent and wastewater. There's a whole range of different ways in which we as local governments interact with nature. And on the right-hand side, it's just really summarised those four sort of key threatening processes. Invasive species and disease is a huge one, and that includes cats, which a lot of people don't want to touch, but is a really big challenge in Australia, as well as habitat loss for for a whole range of things, but for councils predominantly around housing developments. So I guess WWF sort of, and a number of other organisations a number of years ago, sort of recognised that for most people, broader society, there's a very strong awareness of the climate change COPs. And for most people, a COP is a climate change COP. And not many people are aware that there is also a biodiversity one as well. And we sort of noticed that, there is this strong global goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius to limit warming to, as well as this sort of idea of net zero emissions by 2050 is the way that we get there. But what was the equivalent sort of goal for nature? There's a lot of different sort of ideas out there, different sort of sub goals or sub targets, but there wasn't this sort of overarching concept that was easily understood. And so that's sort of where this idea of nature positive came into it. Is sort of like, what is a global goal that's fairly intuitive to understand, and sort of again tells this sort of different story, rather than just sort of faced with this narrative of avoiding impacts and minimizing our impacts. How do we start to think about human society in a way that actually starts to restore and regenerate? And I was fairly cynical about the idea about a year ago, because it felt like another term like sustainability or that comes along and can get misused and abused, etc. But I think I've sort of come around, and I actually quite value the concept, because I think it's intuitive, and it's also something about where we're sort of moving from this sort of continual decline to a world where we're actually starting to see more nature than there is currently by 2030, and full recovery by 2050. So the GBF doesn't actually mention nature positive, but it has that mission and the vision of the 2030 mission and the vision of 2050 within the GBF as well. So that was a really big win, really. And so that's sort of defined in a number of different ways, but I think one of the challenges is, how do you define nature? And I suppose the IPBES, which is effectively the IPCC equivalent for biodiversity, has this fairly long-winded, clunky definition of what nature is. But there is parts of this that I like. It sort of brings in the different types of knowledge systems or worldviews about nature as well. But it also really sort of emphasizes this idea that we're no longer thinking about nature as this sort of separate thing to humans, and trying to bring it back to this interlinked with our own societies. And
Rob, excuse me. Just
Yes,
on your screen, there's a grey kind of box. I think it's got something to do with where your mouse is, maybe. Can you see that grey box?
I can't, but is that better? I just got rid of
Yeah,
I got rid of the
it's
people in the videos. So maybe that was what it was. Does that
yeah,
work?
it seems better now. Let's give that
Okay.
a try. I'll
Yep.
let you know if it pops up again. Thank you.
Sure. So just the other thing to note is that it's not just species. Species are obviously very important, but it's also ecosystems, and we're talking about natural processes. So hydrological processes like floodplains, as well as sort of carbon cycle, etc. So a really key element of the nature positive idea and what came out of the GBF is this idea of protecting 30% of lands and 30% of marine by 2030. And the same sort of goal has been adopted by the Australian government. And it's a fairly significant goal, really, because it's within 6 years. Basically, we have to double the size of protected areas on land, and then all of what we've had since 1872, when Yellowstone National Park was created. So that's pretty enormous, and there is that risk, obviously, that we end up with a lot of quantity over quality in terms of just area rather than the sort of quality of biodiversity. But nonetheless, I think there's a really big opportunity here to sort of start to really protect what's left. And then the other element for this nature positive is improving the rest. So where can we sort of start to regenerate our landscapes and our oceans as well? Many of you, whether it's biodiversity or whether you've worked in waste or climate, have seen similar mitigation hierarchies before, where you've sort of traditionally we would avoid our impacts or refrain from developments, minimize them once we've sort of chosen a site or a project, and then start to work to restore. And then finally, that controversial area of offsetting impacts or compensating for the impacts that we have. So that's sort of been, the long running sort of hierarchy that's been used in biodiversity for a long time. Nature positive really retains that, and still doesn't sort of dilute any of those steps, apart from that sort of last step, which really sort of starts to sort of really encourage businesses, civil society, governments to think about how do you go above and beyond that and start to make some really big contributions to the regenerative and restorative aspects. So for my role, it's very focused on the energy sector, and we're looking at how do we help the renewable energy industry at the moment, where we're seeing very big amounts of clean energy infrastructure roll out across the country, and we'll continue to need to do it pretty fast speed and scale to meet our climate targets. And how do we resolve some of those tensions with biodiversity that we're seeing, whether it's wind farms, solar farms, or transmission lines? And so again, this is really just working through that mitigation hierarchy of, thinking about siting and strategic planning as a way to avoid impacts, thinking about how the projects are designed to minimize those impacts, but then also thinking about, where can we start to sort of think about this in a more regional sense, in bringing developers in to contribute to big landscape scale priority projects. And that's fairly exciting because it sort of, unlocks all of this new finance for nature, and it also starts to crack open the imagination of what's possible, really, where we're not just sort of, compensating for our impacts, but we're actually starting to see a lot of collaboration and partnerships happen for really big regenerative actions. Of course, there's a lot of cynicism about nature positive, and WWF and others have been definitely criticised for sort of pushing this because of the fact that it does have that potential of being, nature, I guess, toxic positivity, in the sense of nothing to see here, and we're just avoiding the fact that we're still having a very big impact. And so I think there is a really strong need to be scrutinising the claims that are being made about nature positive. At this stage, we don't see, any particular project or business or councils being able to sort of claim nature positive because the frameworks and metrics just aren't there yet. But definitely, contributions to that global goal of nature positive is important. So in a similar way with, climate change, with how, councils will have strategies that are aligned with 1.5 degrees rather than being, a 1.5 degree council, or there's other ways to sort of demonstrate that you're sort of contributing to this global goal. There is a lot of different things underway in terms of thinking about how do you actually get some rigor behind this concept. And And there's also a number of different drivers as well that are sort of pushing from different angles, businesses and governments to think more about how do you sort of start to embed nature in all of your decision making. And one of these key ones is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is being rolled out through businesses and governments about looking at your nature-related risks across the different decisions that you make in your businesses, and really starting to sort of think that through and being able to sort of report that back to shareholders and broader society. But at the other end, this Science-Based Targets Network are doing a fair amount of work at the moment about sort of the metrics around nature and how can you start to put some frameworks around how do we set targets for nature, similar to climate change targets, but a lot more difficult because carbon is a bit more of an easier transferable unit, but obviously biodiversity is very complex and local. So, this has been a challenge for a long time, but there's some interesting work underway through that Science-Based Targets Network coming out. And there's also the Nature Positive Initiative, which is doing some work too. So what could all this mean for local government? I don't, want to tell you how to suck eggs, because I think in some ways this isn't too different from what councils have been doing for a long time through different strategies and concepts. But for me, I like to sort of just think about it in those two sort of different ideas of protecting what's left, and different councils will have different sort of degrees in which they've kind of assessed their environmental values or biodiversity across their shires or cities. And really sort of thinking about what level of influence do you have to protect that, whether it's directly through open parks and gardens or through planning controls for private realm, etc. But I think the area that's requires a lot more creativity and it's a lot more exciting is this idea of how do you start to get a lot more sort of nature being brought into cities and within our own towns and communities across the whole country. And there's some really great examples here. Some of them do require some devolution of responsibility, like thinking about communities taking control of nature strips, etc. But really, there's opportunities right across transport, built environment, as well as the sort of standard sort of environment and parks, etc. So I'm aware of time, but I'm just going to quickly wrap up. Are they environmental strategies just rebadged if we start to see these sort of nature positive concepts being brought in? Yes and no. I think the key distinction here is that nature positive is really just trying to lift the ambition. So it's not just about that kind of, fiddling at the edges or avoiding the impacts, but how do we actually start to see some serious investments into nature and start to sort of crack open what's possible. There's a really good sort of guide by Pollination with a diagram here on the right that this sort of talks through the different approaches to developing a nature positive strategy. So it would be interesting to see if any councils start to look at doing this for their own council. Just to wrap up, nature positive, I think, is an exciting new concept that isn't without its challenges in terms of being defined by others or used in the wrong ways, but it's definitely a way that can help us sort of think differently about nature going forward. And there's my little alarm, but I think definitely local government can lead the way and has many opportunities to do so. I've just got two sources there that you could look at when the slides are shared. And finally, just from my own personal perspective, I live in central Victoria, and behind my house, it used to look like this in 1858 in the goldfields in completely denuded landscape. And now is this sort of lovely riparian corridor that's been replanted through a land care group for the last 40 years. So we can do this and we know it's possible, and it happens, and it's been happening for a very long time. It's just how do we sort of scale that up to make nature positive a reality. So I will stop my sharing and pass back. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. That was really awesome to hear your thoughts and reflections. And you've introduced us to a few more acronyms and a few more important initiatives that we all need to bear in mind with our work. But, I think that idea of, protecting what's left and improving the rest and lifting ambition and, through our planning, really crucial for us going forward. Now, Dr. Judy Bush is up next. So Judy, are you right to start sharing your slides now? And we'll listen to you and then we'll do some questions.
No worries. Thank you. Can you see my screen, and can you hear me?
Loud and clear, and can see your screens too. Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and fabulous to come after my previous speakers. Some of the material carries across in all our presentations, which is probably a good thing, right? So first of all, I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country. This is a representation of Wurundjeri seasons, and we're currently in tadpole season. Puneet, I acknowledge the diversity of cultural heritage and country across Australia, and pay respects to traditional custodians and their knowledge. So my talk today is very much focused on cities. More than half of us live in cities now, and as you can see on the slide, by 2050, 2/3 of all humanity will be urban. And so sustainable development and biodiversity conservation and restoration will need to take account of how we build and manage our urban areas. Cities are really important for biodiversity. We know that threatened species live in urban areas, and indeed there are some threatened species that are restricted to urban areas. So we can't any longer think about, oh, well, it's okay, you know, beyond the city edge, it's all biodiversity. There are some threatened species that actually are restricted to urban areas only. So we've already heard this morning about GBIF or GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. It has 4 goals: protect and restore, prosper, share benefits, invest and collaborate. And then, of course, we've heard about Target 12, the urban target in GBIF. But indeed, there's 23 targets. I've pulled out a range of them that I think are particularly relevant to local government. You can see that they're grouped under those 3 categories of reducing threats, meeting people's needs, and then tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. So my question that I want to answer, that I want to address in my presentation is, what are the roles for local government in working towards these goals and these targets? And so these are my 7 priorities that I'd like to highlight today. And I will work through each of these separately. So let's jump straight into it. First of all, biodiversity strategies and plans. So many of you, I was watching names as they were joining the webinar today and seeing many familiar names. Hello, all of those who I have already met. I know that many of you actually are working at local governments that have developed really interesting biodiversity strategies and plans. And indeed, you know, thinking about what needs to be in biodiversity strategies and plans, I would look to some of yours as leading examples. So I would say that biodiversity strategies need to consider all these elements: an organisational statement, a commitment to action that's been strategically developed, a statement around the context, challenges and opportunities that you face in your municipality, identification of your goals, priorities and targets, and a policy framework. How does your biodiversity strategy connect with your other strategies and indeed with other levels of government? We've heard about multi-level governance today. Who are your partners and collaborators, and how are you going to work with them? And how are you going to extend your influence and indeed undertake advocacy? So I think having an organisational biodiversity strategy is key as a first step of commitment, and then as the justification for then making your budget bids and implementing action on the ground and doing it in a strategically well-founded way. Secondly, conserve and restore. You might be able to hear the frogs in the background here. I'm not sure if you can. It's I couldn't work out what the sound was at first. But this is a wetland in Merri Creek in Northcote in Naarm. This is what it looked like in the 1980s, a retarding basin. This is what it looks like in 2022 and the frogs calling. So we need to conserve what we already have. We need to restore other areas, and we need to focus on creating a multifunctional connected network. We've heard about nature-based solutions and green infrastructure as ways of framing that work. There's been some really important research looking at the value of single large versus several small reserves. And indeed, having a multifunctional connected network of small reserves can actually, research has shown, can be as effective at conserving a range of different species. So rather than relying on one large reserve, often several small reserves can be very effective, may also be easier to maintain. Also, in terms of restoration, really thinking about the areas that we can extend our nature coverage and our nature actions beyond the sort of standard nature reserves to actually thinking about utilities, corridors, pipe tracks and so on, even converting road space. And this last point, gardening for wildlife, some of you may be involved in that program that's encouraging local residents to look at biodiversity in their own private realm. We definitely need to connect with country and to foreground traditional owners' knowledge, cultural heritage and aspirations for country. And that involves all of us connecting with traditional owners' activities that are happening in our areas. We need to read Indigenous authors. We need to attend events like cultural tours and yarning circles. We need to seek out art and music of country where we are. There's also been some really interesting research that I've been reading and connecting with lately, highlighting culturally sensitive species. So this is expanding our view beyond, for example, a focus on threatened species only, but also thinking, connecting with traditional owners and finding out about the culturally sensitive species of country. So I have included these links here that'll be in the slides when they get distributed. And these two journal papers, research papers here are written by Aboriginal authors and highlight some of the recent research on culturally sensitive species. Tree retention is also super important in urban areas. And again, you know, the principle of looking after what we already have, finding ways to retain large old trees. I'm sure all of us in the webinar today share the frustration of hearing about one large old tree being cut down and being supposedly reassured by the idea that, you know, it's okay, we'll plant 15 tiny little saplings to make up for it. I'm now at an age where I won't see those trees replaced by those saplings. So I think that this is a really important element of our work. It's a really important part of local councils too, walking the talk. So we need to think about trees on private land. Definitely, we need to look at policy mechanisms and so on. But we also need to see councils walking the talk on not removing large old trees and shifting default options, mainstreaming retention of large old trees. In terms of encouraging private landowners to retain trees, there's some local governments have started bringing in tree retention regulations, planting regulations and so on. And regulations are super important, but I think we also need to push incentives. We need to think about how to shift the narrative from saying you can't do this or you must, you know, here's the bottom line, to actually encouraging a sense of stewardship and shared responsibility and contribution to the larger urban fabric. And maybe we can do that through a focus on stewardship and incentives. And incentives are not just financial incentives such as rate rebates or subsidies and grants, but also non-financial incentives. Awards, you know, maybe we could, in local government annual awards, have an urban forester of the year or a tree steward of the year, and celebrate some of the large old trees in our municipality and the fact that they continue to thrive and prosper and provide habitat and so on. Monitoring, number 6. Monitoring. Monitoring is, as Rob highlighted, you know, when we're talking about climate change, our unit of measurement is CO2 or CO2 equivalent. And it's pretty, well, it's not straightforward. We all recognise it's not straightforward, but at least it's a single indicator. Whereas with biodiversity, it is, as we all know, so much more complex. So GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, for Target 12, there is one indicator, and that indicator is average share of built-up area of cities, that is green blue space for public use for all. Okay, so that's a quantity indicator. In contrast, some of you may have heard of the City Biodiversity Index. That has 23 indicators. So that's a really complex data collection and data management undertaking if local governments were to utilise the City Biodiversity Index for their monitoring work. I think this is still very much an open question and a challenging question. And I think this is a really important area for a community of practice amongst local government to continue discussing and sharing how you are all undertaking the monitoring work, because obviously to be able to track action, to be able to know if we are heading towards nature positive, but also to be able to adaptively manage and continue to plan our actions for biodiversity conservation and restoration, we need to be monitoring. I'd say there's potentially a really important opportunity for citizen science contributions to monitoring. You know, this is one of these situations where citizen science can potentially contribute to the data collection task, as well as foregrounding and reinforcing the importance of stewardship and community involvement and partnerships. And so that leads me to I think the final point, which is collaborations and partnerships. So collaboration is not an easy process. It's about working together. It's about finding how we can each contribute our own skills, This diagram here is from some research that we did actually during COVID. I remember doing this research through Zoom calls, which was pretty intense. But what we were looking at was how collaborative governance can be sustained. So there's a whole lot of research showing how to set up collaborative governance arrangements, but how do we sustain it over the long term? And we reached a point where we felt that it was about the characteristics of the individuals involved in the collaboration, also the group itself, having clear structure, principles, processes, and so on. The context, so having a shared motivation, and then it's very much place-based, of course. And so being able to bring together all those elements is really important in the collaborative endeavour. So to conclude, and I'm whizzing through so that Cara doesn't give me the wind up. To conclude, I think I'd like to highlight these 4 priorities. We obviously need to be planning our biodiversity in the context of climate change and climate extremes. We need to think about an ecological focus that includes both threatened species and culturally significant species. We need to localise approaches that bring together local knowledges. You know, Rob's example of the 40-year restoration of the local waterway shows that there's incredible local knowledge being accumulated there. And of course, we need to foreground Indigenous knowledges and custodianship. So I also have some information and resources to share. So I know looking at the names of participants, I know some of you participated in an amazing symposium last year that City of Melbourne organised, dispelling myths about urban biodiversity. And out of that event, this playbook for urban biodiversity was developed. It's, I think, a really useful resource. In New South Wales, the government architect has recently released this biodiversity in place framework to improve urban biodiversity. So I think this is also a really useful resource document, and you know it reinforces more nature in our backyards, balconies, rooftops and verges, so very much in the built environment, in the urban space. And then just on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, I subscribe to The Conversation. I think it's a fantastic source of information. Many of you probably also subscribe to it. As you would know, it's relatively short articles, all written by academics as a way of disseminating research. So I recently had this article published about Merri Creek and Merri Creek's restoration. You can subscribe to daily email bulletins. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and yeah, really interested to hear the discussion now about how you're all going with biodiversity action in local areas.
Thank you, Judy. That was an amazing summary of a lot of time and effort that you've put into research and working in this space. So it was lovely to hear your thoughts, and I love the idea of Tree Steward of the Year and having Tree of the Year, and also, you know, very interested perhaps in, you know, seeing if we can actually get together a community of practice, looking at how we undertake monitoring and yeah, just I guess make sense of all these different ways that we can monitor, given we don't have anything, that's concrete for Australia in this space as yet. So
Can I say
thank you.
tangible, not concrete?
That might be a better word. Absolutely. Thank you. Now, we might get into some questions. So if you've got a question, now's the time to either pop it into the chat or put your hand up, and we will endeavour to get to your questions. Now, Councillor Amanda Stone, did you have any questions while we're waiting for people in the audience to put their hand up or to ask a question in the chat?
Always, but there was a question quite early on from Deborah from Mornington asking, do you want to ask that first? Are the rights of nature principles a good framework to lead into supporting biodiversity at a local level? She posted that at 11:17, so might be good to start with that.
Yeah, let's lead off with that. Judy or Rob, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I saw that and I liked it. I'm aware maybe Blue Mountains Council attempted to bring that in, and a council in WA, I think.
That's right, correct.
Correct, yes. But I don't know. Yeah, I'd love to know more about how that looks in terms of, how much weight that gives nature in decision making versus.
Well,
yeah,
talk about
Deborah.
Yes, the level of the other governments. It's just falling on deaf ears at the moment. I actually did put through a notice of motion 2 years ago, being a councillor in the Mornington Peninsula Shire Council, and it got a little bit of traction. I got 4 action points from that. I've been following them up, and the feedback that I'm getting from officers is, well, really it has to come from a higher being. So what I've been faced with is a conflict between the planning scheme and preserving nature, not only what we've got or to conserve, but it's being just ripped from under us through planning and the new plan for Victoria. The plan that they've got putting in place through the housing statement last year. So I don't know how much more to do. I've already spoken to our 2 local MPs, federal and state, still no traction. So I have spoken to other areas of federal government, and I'm not getting any traction. So Rob, I don't know where to go from here. I'm not standing again in this election, but I've got projects that I want to focus on, and they are the rights of nature principles and conserving. And what everybody said today certainly rings and resonates with me to get on with my life and my projects in this space. So is it talked about in your area, Rob, and even Judy?
So a couple of things to say. I think rights of nature is increasingly being looked at in research. I think we can look to the Birrarung Act as an interesting example here in Victoria. So as many of you would know, the Birrarung Act was the first piece of Australian legislation co-titled in the traditional owners' language as well as English. So it's a really interesting piece of legislation. The reason why I think of it is because it identifies the Birrarung, the Yarra River, as a single natural living entity. So it doesn't go as far as to give the river personhood or to talk about the rights of nature, but it's a step, and it sets up the Birrarung Council with legislated requirements for traditional owner membership of that council. Again, the council is an advocacy and advisory body. It doesn't have power in itself. So anyway, that's the first thing. The second thing I was thinking was, yeah, fair enough. Great framework to push for. but also at the same time use what we have. And the federal government presumably are a signatory to the Convention for Biological Diversity, and so that's got those. I presented the 4 goals, the 23 targets. They've signed up to them. Let's get going.
Yes, that's right. Minister Plebisek has got on board with that. So I'm really hoping that is pushed forward.
Yeah. So I think that's that's an existing point that we can push for. You've agreed to this. Let's get going with the action. There's there's an article in The Conversation today talking about the hurdles that Labor is facing trying to get legislation through federal parliament, and it really does reinforce the complexity of the politics of biodiversity.
Yes, well, at least I've started the conversation down here on the Mornington Peninsula, so I hope that the next group actually follow that through. So thank you so much, Judy and Rob. And Amanda. You've been amazing, Amanda.
Now, have we got any other questions? I haven't seen anything else popping into the chat just yet, but is there anybody on the call that would like to ask a question verbally? If you want to, just pop your video on if you'd like.
Robin and Judy, just to follow up from Deb, the last point about the national legislation that Judy raised, and the nature positive legislation is having a hard time. It's being delayed a number of times. What do Judy and Rob see in that legislation as it stands, that might support local governments? And being very practical, we all need money. And I think there was an expectation that there might be funding streams that arise out of this legislation. But on top of that, what do you see would be the benefits for local governments, if any?
Sorry, Amanda. To be fair, I'm not part of the team. We do a lot of work directly with the federal government on this, but I'm not really fully across it. But I think in terms of our main push has really been about strengthening that core, EPBC Act as part of these reforms, as where, the sort of the last guardrail really for those federal national matters of environmental significance. So, but at the local level and at the state level, a lot happens that falls through, that never makes it through to that federal level anyway. And that's where I think biodiversity, we think about that sort of idea of death by 1,000 cuts. I think that's where a lot of the stuff sort of gets lost, and the federal stuff is really just almost that last resort. Things like the EPA that have been proposed and the Environmental Information Australia, they're good things, but they're not the substantive reforms that we've been calling for. And in terms of local government, I'm not fully across what might come through from all of that in terms of support.
Thank you. Won't have high expectations then.
Now, we just have another question that's come through in the chat from Linton. It says, biodiversity conservation legislation currently places far too much price on clearing of vegetation. There's not a real disincentive for developers clearing existing vegetation, and planners are restricted to following those guidelines unless strongly supported by local councillors who are prepared to put their position on the line. Any comments on that statement from Linton? Sorry,
Cara, can I just clarify that current legislation puts far too low a price on biodiversity, and there's no, so developers, if they're going to sell a block of land for $500,000, a few $1,000s for a biodiversity credit liability is not a disincentive to retain native veg. We're all talking about retaining what we've got. The legislation doesn't support it because the market doesn't support it. So the market needs to be regulated. Sorry, that was my comment. Any suggestions, answers, or comments on that?
Well, only that I agree with you. I don't quite know the solution to it, apart from I guess it's the challenge, isn't it, with councils sort of that are trying to reach canopy cover targets, and they're doing everything they can on their own land, but then they've got this sort of continual loss in sort of those sort of single lot developments, particularly where they have less control. So it's a really big challenge. I would love to know who can crack it.
Yeah, Rob, just on that too, if I can just weigh in, we've just passed an urban forest strategy, which focuses on areas that nature strips, reserves, and have that in the forethinking that this is an urban space for a wildlife tree canopy. And we've got areas that are as low as 14% canopy cover in some townships. And it's so we've put some strategies in place. We've got a biodiversity conservation plan and strategy that really needs to be updated now. I think it was 2018, so that has to be re-looked at in the next term of council. So that's one way, but of course everything that goes to BCAT then is overturned most of the time. But I would like to see the planning scheme change, where if the developers are looking at a block, that trees must be retained and they actually build around the trees, not the other way around, if you know what I mean. So whether that's one point to consider. But yes, we have to become, our thinking has to change from human-centred to earth-centred. So how we do that, I believe it's only a matter of time, because we've taken for granted what we have around us. It includes wildlife, our native wildlife. It's always been there. We've taken it for granted. When it's gone, that's when people will start questioning, what did we do? What did we do wrong? So that's where
There are some great comments in the chat on this. It's
Yeah.
obviously a bit of a hot topic.
I'm looking at the question about fines and incentives. I think there's an example. I don't know the details, so this is slightly vague of me, but I understand that the construction of the Royal Children's Hospital was shifted to avoid the cost of tree removal that was being imposed on the construction. So in that case, the tree removal costs were calculated at a rate that actually made a difference to the economics of the construction. So I think, associated with some of the global work that's happening, like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and nature valuation, actually creating frameworks and benchmarks that provide a better calculation of nature's value, and translating that to an economic sense might have some influence.
I think also it's a bit of carrot and stick, isn't it? It's very easy to put in a plan that requires the removal of a big tree. It's nothing to a developer. But if a council can say no, and we've had cases where developments have required the removal of a big old plane tree, for example, and we've said no, councillors have said no, they have to redesign, and often it's a better outcome. It's just it's easiest in the first instance to get rid of the tree because it's not seen as valuable. So I think if councils can find a way to push back a little bit, it will redirect, a bit like the Children's Hospital, it will redirect thinking a little bit more, as it has with a whole lot of other initiatives over time. It's a bit of both.
Yeah, totally agree that it needs to be both. And I spoke at TreeNet conference last week, and I talked about carrots and sticks, and one of the participants talked about carrots, sticks and fences. So actually the fence being this is the no-go zone, this is, So that's an interesting idea that I need to think about a bit more. I think also being able to actually point to developers who are trying to do better is maybe also a useful process. And so, for example, a developer who funded some of my research, he asked me to do a research report for him highlighting the values of green spaces in urban areas. And he also funded another consultant to look at the economic perspectives. And he has, you know, aimed to retain as many trees as possible in a couple of the sort of infill developments that he's been doing in Melbourne. I mean, we should be pointing to these examples as benefits. His argument is that you get property uplift from properties facing directly onto green space, so therefore you can afford to have more green space and still reap the same profit from your development. So, you know, we need to start celebrating that work as well.
I think that's a really nice point there, Judy, and I think you know, that's a point also that Kay in the chat has also made, that we need to start thinking of alternatives and different ways of doing things. So now I'm just conscious of time, and we're supposed to be finishing at 15:15, and I just wanted to say a few words before we wrap up. So I've probably got 5 minutes at most of just a few little slides and things, just other resources that I wanted to share with you all. So, so if you could bear with me just while I go through that, that would be awesome. So basically, I just wanted to share with you some great new things that are coming out from sorry, I've just lost my screen for whatever reason. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. Oh, there you are. Sorry, I'm just moved. Everything's just moved for whatever reason. Gremlins in my system. But yeah, so Judy and Robin mentioned some great resources, and on top of that, there are some other bits and pieces that are available from Council, from ICLEI, and also from other places. So the Berlin Nature Pact, or Urban Nature Pact, is brand new, and it's basically about to be launched in Cali at COP16 next month. So you guys are actually the first in the world to hear about this officially. So it's very exciting to be able to tell you. So the pact basically seeks to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery in cities worldwide by 2030 for the benefit of people and the planet. And it builds on an Edinburgh Declaration and the Montreal Pledge, and focuses on the implementation of the GBF and its action plan. But basically, there are 28 targets that are part of it in seven target areas that you can see there. And the aim for councils or for cities that sign up to it is to achieve 15 of those 28 targets. Now, essentially, the people that sign up to this will use the Cities with Nature Action Platform, and I'll tell you about that in a second, to track their progress of their commitments that they do. So definitely look out for that in the next month or so, being launched through ICLEI. Now, in terms of the Cities with Nature Action Platform, it's a free global action platform where councils can connect, learn and share their targets and actions and case studies on what they're achieving locally to help achieve the GBF goals and targets. Now, the idea is that you make a commitment or make commitments, you list specific actions that you're going to take, and you set some targets in the actual platform. Sharon, can you go to that next slide for me, please? And I'll just give you, there's a little bit of a sneak peek about how it looks, but essentially you can track everything in there, and you can also report through there as well. And then that actually, every time that there is a conference of party for the CBD, that this information actually then gets reported up to it, and so do the case studies that get put in there. So it'd be great to see some Australian councils using the Cities with Nature Action platform in future, alongside 400 other cities that are currently using that and reporting using it. Now, also on the Cities with Nature website is the City Biodiversity Index. Now, Judy mentioned this before. It's also called the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. Now, if you are a registered user on the Cities with Nature platform, you can then access the digital version of this, and you can actually use the online calculator to actually work out your score against the index. So it's great that ICLEI was able to digitise this and actually make this all online. So I would encourage you again, if you're looking to try and work out where you are and benchmark yourself, to actually register with the Cities with Nature platform and get into the City Biodiversity Index as well. And the good thing about it is you can then link it up with the action platform and the actions that you're putting into that. Now, the Urban Green Infrastructure Planning and Decision Work Framework Handbook, it's a very big mouthful, is actually available on the Standards Australia website, and it provides guidance for the commissioning, design, planning, approval, construction, maintenance and operation of urban green infrastructure elements, systems and networks. So it was designed by a technical committee of experts led by the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, and it's designed to be used for Australian industry and government professionals. So if you work in planning, engineering, design, research, construction, or if you're a policymaker, this could be worth the investment, which is under $200. So you might want to have a look at that as well. Now, Journeys for Life is another brand new program which ICLEI is just launching at the moment. So if you've got migratory species visiting your region or your municipality, this might be of interest for you. And basically, it's supporting the Convention for the Conservation of Migratory Species. And it's a platform that cities can use to actually connect with each other and to facilitate the exchange of knowledge, resources, and best practices. And so basically how it works is cities nominate a species, and then the nominating city then needs to find other cities that they can work with and involve them in the program, which are located along that migratory route. So the first two species have been worked out, and so that's the green African pigeon, and that's been led by Ivory Coast in Africa, and the osprey, which has been led in the east coast of the US as well. So Australia has an opportunity to be part of that next round. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can email Ivana, whose email is in that bottom right-hand corner there, or you can email me and let me know your thoughts. And also in the post-event survey, I've put some information in there as I put a question in there. So if you've got any ideas or if you want to be involved, let us know through that. Now, just to let you know as well, we've got a couple of other webinars coming up. These are for ICLEI members. So we've got a biodiversity reporting webinar coming up, looking at the Australian context, I guess, to follow on from some of these conversations we've been having today. That'll be in late October. And also in November, we've got the Biodiverse Cities from Planning to Practice webinar, which has been run by Europe Office of ICLEI. And that's actually looking at how the new European nature restoration laws and how urban nature plans, which they're being forced to do over there as a result of this new law, are being used as crucial law tools for achieving that law's targets. And finally, just to do a bit of a plug as well, we have got many ways that we can support you in your journey to improving nature and biodiversity in your patch. So ICLEI Oceania can offer technical assistance and consultancy, whether that be helping you to update or develop your biodiversity or nature plans, aligning your plans with the City Biodiversity Index or the Urban Nature Pact when that comes out. We also have a community of practice, which is just launching, which is available to ICLEI members and also non-member councils, which is under $1,000 for member councils and under $1,200 for non-members, where we'll have regular meetings, have a Slack space for online chats. There'll be tech support for the Cities with Nature Action platform, and also some other member benefits as well. And we can actually, just leading on from what Judy was saying before, we can actually create learning cohorts as well, where clusters of councils come together to work on a particular topic, whether that be research, tools, or on a particular project. And these can be local, and they can actually have global links, like that Cities with Nature coastal community of practice that's been created. So look, we've taken up way too much of your time, or over the amount of time that we promised to take up today, but I really just wanted to thank you all for attending today and for hanging around until the end. And thank you to Rob and to Judy and to Amanda for being part of our webinar, and to Sharon for helping look after the tech side of things. Now, if you want any further information, please feel free to reach out to us via email, or you can have a look at our website if you want some more information. And look, finally, I'd really love if you could, for you to just complete the survey, which is just on the screen there, because that will help us greatly to understand what you're looking for future webinars. And also, if you're interested in participating in the Journeys for Life, that would be great to also get your feedback on any species and which regions that might be included in that project going forward. So look, thank you so much for attending, everybody. It's been lovely to see you. Thank you for all your questions and for your enthusiasm. And I hope that you've found this useful today. If you need anything else, just don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you very much and have an awesome day.